Hey everyone, I'm Mike from Regala Photography, where we talk about everything photography. Today, we're talking about a topic that's been buzzing around YouTube community recently. Are these product reviews, or showcasings, if you will, honest and unbiased, or are they just paid infomercials for the brands? Have you ever wondered if that glowing product recommendation is genuine or just a cleverly disguised sales pitch? Well, stick around because we're about to unravel the mysteries behind the YouTube product promotions. Before we jump into the nitty gritty, let's just set the stage. The YouTube landscape has evolved into a marketplace where creators often collaborate with brands. Whether it's photo gear, tech gadgets, or lifestyle products, influencers are regularly showcasing various items on their channels. But the question remains, are these reviews unbiased opinions or elaborate infomercials? Recently, I've seen several videos talking about paid sponsorships or our product reviews a joke. And it sparked something in me to further investigate and further that discussion on that topic. A YouTuber by the name of Miguel Quiles, he has a video called Photography Gear Reviews on YouTube Are a Joke, which I will link in the description below. He made several great points about YouTubers doing gear reviews for money. So if you get a chance, go ahead and watch this video. Plus, I did recently have a minor run-in with a very popular YouTuber who posted a video saying he will only include a product in one of his videos if he's being paid to do so. So I asked him, I'm like, well, how could you remain unbiased if the brand is paying you for the review? And he replied back, who said anything about reviews? Which seemed a little bit defensive to me. If you're into photography gear, you're always looking for the latest and greatest gadget to help you capture or edit your next viral photo. The first place I always go to find out more about a product is right here on YouTube. There are thousands and thousands of gear reviews, unboxings, and demos right here on YouTube. One key factor to consider is transparency. Legitimate creators understand the importance of disclosing their relationships with brands, so keep an eye out for phrases like, this video is sponsored by, or I received this product for free, but my opinions are my own. These statements usually indicate a level of transparency, allowing the viewers to make informed judgments about the content that they're consuming and whether or not the products are biased or unbiased. I should say the reviews are biased or unbiased. Another aspect to analyze is whether the product aligns with the creator's usual content and values. Does it seem out of place for a photography guru to suddenly endorse an automotive detail product? If the product doesn't really align with the creator's usual content, it could be a red flag that it's more of an infomercial than a genuine recommendation. We've all seen those videos where creators gush over a product like it's the second coming. While genuine excitement is contagious, excessive enthusiasm might be a sign that content is more of a performance than an honest review. Look for subtle cues in body language, the tone, to decipher between a genuine passion or a scripted excitement. Now, here's a real deal breaker. Audience engagement. Pay attention to the comments section below a video review. If the viewers are sharing authentic experiences with the product, asking questions and having meaningful discussions, it's a good sign that the content has resonated positively. However, if the comments seem overly positive or generic, it just could be a sign of manipulation. As consumers, it's crucial to approach product reviews on YouTube with a critical eye. Transparency, alignment with values, and genuine audience engagement are key factors in distinguishing between authentic reviews and a slick infomercial. Remember, not all product promotions are misleading, but it's essential to be discerning in the age of influencer marketing. If you found this video helpful, please hit that subscribe button and the like button below. It really does help my channel. Ring that bell if you want to be notified when my next video is posted. Until next time, take care, everyone.